Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled Out of EUA, FDA's Guidance and Recommendation. I'm Kate Klaus, Senior Attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Dr. Jianlin Song, thank you for joining us. Jianlin Song began her professional life as a physician in Beijing, China, which provided her with a solid background and extensive knowledge to represent companies and individual practitioners in the life sciences and healthcare industries after she changed her career path from medicine to law. During her 15-year legal career, Dr. Song has defended manufacturers of a broad spectrum of life science products, from food supplements and dental adhesives to prescription drugs and medical devices. She has also represented clinical and diagnostic laboratories and dental, medical, and nursing practitioners in professional malpractice cases. In addition to litigation, Dr. Song counsels domestic and international companies on compliance and risk management relating to FDA regulations. She has helped companies from various parts of Asia to market their COVID-19 related products in the United States. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Dr. Song.
Thank you, Kate. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, Out of EUA, FDA's Guidance and Recommendations. This is our second webinar on the topic of EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. And I'm pretty sure there will be a third webinar on the same topic. This is a very interesting, fascinating, and ever-changing area. So our first webinar on this topic was held in July of last year, where we talked about the regulatory requirements of EUAs as well as the legal implications once the EUAs are revoked or terminated. We predicted at the end of the last seminar that as we were approaching to the end of the pandemic, hopefully, the FDA would terminate all of its COVID-19 EUAs, and the manufacturers must start preparing to transition their products out of the EUA and back to the FDA's normal operations. We also predicted that the FDA would publish guidance documents to help manufacturers going through this transition period. And just like what we said, the guidance documents were published 5 months after our webinar. They were published in the end of last December, and the public comments are being solicited till tomorrow. The end of public commenting period is March 23rd, 2022. Unfortunately, because of our busy work schedule, we could not give this webinar earlier than until the day before the end of the public comment period. However, we believe that this webinar is still going to be helpful, hopefully very helpful to you, because just as the rest of the FDA publications, those guidance documents can be hard to understand. There are vague statements, there are confusing statements. So my hope is by this webinar, we can provide explanations or clarifications to the extent that we can to help you understand what the FDA asks you to do. We do not expect there will be much substantive changes in the final guidance. Therefore, we hope that this webinar will help you once the final guidance is published and the transition finally officially start. This webinar will help you to understand what the FDA asks you to do to ensure that you go through that transition period smoothly. Okay, with that long introduction and without further ado, let's turn to today's webinar. First, a little bit of recap of what we talked about last July. An emergency use authorization is a temporary and much expedited pathway that the FDA is authorized to take during at times of public health emergency. It allows the FDA to approve an unapproved medical product or to approve an unapproved usage, an off-label usage of an approved medical product. An EUA is issued by the issuance of an EUA declaration from the Secretary of HHS, Department of Human Health and Services, declare that circumstances now justify the FDA to take that temporary authority. From March of 2020, since the official start of the public health emergency due to COVID-19, to this date, the FDA has issued more than 900 EUAs. And as close as we are to the end of the public health emergency, the FDA is still reviewing and issuing new EUAs. How will an EUA terminate? An EUA will be terminated by the termination of the HHS Secretary's EUA declaration. And of course, a EUA will also be terminated if the FDA decides to revoke the EUA, or if the FDA gives the final approval or clearance to that product. But that's not the focus of today's webinar. So today we're gonna only focusing on the termination of the HHS Secretary's EUA declaration. What is important to know is that the Secretary of the HHS, before they terminate their EUA declaration, they are required to publish an advance notice on the Federal Register of their termination of the EUA to give the manufacturers some advance notice so they can start disposing of their products once they are no longer authorized. Under the FDA's normal operation, the advance notice will be published only 2 or 3 days before the termination of the declaration. Really not that much notice is given. However, as you will see, in the guidance documents to help transition the COVID-19 EUAs, the FDA promised a 180-day advance notice, which is a significantly extended period. It reflects the FDA's anticipation of this transition of some 900 EUAs going back to the normal operation. And this is going to be a massive, complicated transition process. So those documents, the guidance documents published on December, I think, 23rd last year, they are entitled transition plans. There is a transition plan for medical devices issued emergency use authorization during the coronavirus disease 2019 public health emergency. This is the main document that we are going to discuss today. On the same date, the FDA also published a companion document. That's the FDA's word. This is a companion document, which is entitled Transition Plan for Medical Devices that fall within enforcement policies issued during the coronavirus disease 2019 public health emergency. This document refers to the products that most of them are class 1 products that do not need authorization or clearance or approval. And under normal operation, they would only need to comply with FDA's policies to be able to get on the United States market, such as hand sanitizers. And during the COVID-19 period, the FDA publishes enforcement policies, which is a much simplified, streamlined process to help those class 1 products to get on the market quickly. So that companion plan imposes basically the same requirements as the transition plan for the EUA authorized products. It just has a slightly little different time frame. So at the end of our webinar today, we'll tell you what the different time frame is under the enforcement policy plan. As usual, the FDA has to give a disclaimer statement. It's not law, it's not binding. It does not give any private citizen any right to sue. What I think needs a little bit of attention here is that the FDA says that you can use approach as long as it satisfies the requirements of the applicable statutes and regulations. Normally, I do not recommend my client to take any alternative approach. I recommend them to do exactly what the FDA recommends them to do. However, in the situation of COVID-19, we realize, and the FDA realizes it, that there are always special circumstances that we cannot fully predict beforehand. So if it becomes necessary for your company to, if it is impossible for your company to follow what the FDA says in these guidance documents, and you have to take an alternative approach, talk to the FDA, get their blessings. They will understand and they will lead you through the process. Introduction. I want to tell you that for the convenience of my audience, my slides are organized exactly the same way as the guidance document is structured. So when I refer to section, certain section, certain subsection, you will know immediately where in the guidance document I'm talking about. Hopefully that will help you to understand that exact, the exact language in that guidance document. So the first section, introduction, the FDA defines manufacturers as who designs, manufactures, fabricates, assembles, or processes a finished device. That will include the original equipment manufacturers, or in short terms, OEMs, as well as the contractor manufacturers. If you are only processing a finished device, you are subject to these guidance documents. As to importers and distributors, you are also required to study the guidance documents and comply with the requirements as long as they are applicable to you. You may not be required to take all the actions, but you still need to read the documents and know where it applies to you. The second, another definition is normal operations. In the FDA's guidance documents related to COVID-19, whenever the FDA talks about normal operations, it means the FDA's regulation framework before the pandemic and after the pandemic. So if the FDA requires you to be compliant with normal operations, it means that the EUA terms are no longer applicable to your product. Background. A very important information is provided in the background section, which is the FDA will give you 180 days. Not only because the FDA wants to help the companies through this complicated transition process, it also reflects, more importantly, reflects the FDA's recognition and awareness of the global supply chain crisis that we are facing right now. The FDA's objective, at least one of its objectives, is to ensure the continuous public access to these medical devices, which is a very important message because that leads to the FDA's, later on in these documents, the FDA talks about that they do not intend to request the manufacturers to take their products off the market once the EUA terminates. They also do not intend to, in some circumstances, do not request that the manufacturers to immediately discontinue the distribution of their products, which gives the manufacturers huge flexibility to deal with this massive transition. Here is an example of the FDA HHS's Advanced Notice. This was published on the Federal Register website. That's where you look for advanced notices from the HHS. And this was an advanced notice for the termination of an in vitro diagnostic device before the pandemic. It was published on June 21st, 2010. You should ignore that June 25th notice period. from that notice, it says that it was published on June 21st with an EUA termination date of June 25. So 4 days of notice, not that much advanced at all. And now the FDA will give you 180 days. Scope of application of these guidance documents. The transition plan of the EUA document applies to devices that have been issued an EUA during COVID-19 on the COVID-19 related purposes. It does not apply to products for which the EUA was terminated before the end of the pandemic, was revoked before the end of the pandemic. Guiding principles. The message that you can get from these stated guiding principles will help you to understand how the FDA plans on operating this transition period. First, the FDA aims at facilitate continued access. As I said, the FDA will not disturb your already distributed products, and you can, in certain circumstances, you can continue distributing your products, provided that you do what the FDA asks you to. You take the steps that the FDA asks you to take. Another purpose is to ensure an orderly and transparent transition. So the FDA welcome you to talk to them and to make them aware of your plans. And also, the transition will follow a risk-based approach. Just like the FDA regulates all of the medical devices during normal operation, the regulation is a risk-based approach. It depends on what type of products you have, whether you have a class 1, class 2, or class 3, what are the potential risks? And you are required to have plans on how do you plan on dealing with the potential risks. And last but not least, FDA may still take actions regarding specific devices, including revocation or revision of EUAs, withdrawal or revision of an enforcement policy, or taking any other enforcement actions, notwithstanding the steps prescribed in these guidance documents, notwithstanding your compliance with those steps. When the circumstances calls for any special enforcement action, the FDA reserves its rights to take them. Section 5, the most important section of the guidance document, transition plan. The FDA encourages manufacturers to engage in discussion with them as early as possible. The discussion can be done through a Q submission program, which is a program published on the FDA's website. It allows the manufacturers to submit their questions or even a request to talk to an FDA representative. You can submit these requests through that website. And pre-submission is also encouraged. Pre-submission is a very helpful tool for you to test the water, you can submit a pre-submission before your EUA submission or before your 510K or even a PMA submission. You can, if there are any issues that you're not so certain about, you can ask the FDA's inputs, ask for their comments, and then tailor your final marketing submission toward what the FDA would like for you to include, would like for you to do. And the first formal action that the FDA expects you to take is a notification of intent for certain products. If you have certain reusable, life-supporting, or life-sustaining devices, which covers most of the class 3 and some class 2 devices, then you are required to submit a notification of intent. to tell the FDA beforehand, upfront, whether you intend to continue distributing your product after the termination of its EUA, or whether you intend not to continue distributing your product after the termination of an EUA. The guidance documents has a table, which is, I think it's an exclusive, all-inclusive table. It lists the product code of all of the reusable, life-supporting, life-sustaining devices that the FDA expect you to file the notification of intent. So you should look at the first, the left-hand column, product code. The products include some anesthesia gas machine, oxygen generator, respiratory gas humidifier, and many types of ventilators, as well as tubing connectors for cold venting. So look at the product code. If your product falls under any of these codes, you should start filing notification of intent as soon as possible. The notification of intent should be submitted ASAP after the guidance is finalized, after the FDA publishes finalized guidance. If you have to submit your notification of intent after the publication of Advanced Notice, which will be published soon after we have the finalized guidance. So if you have to submit your notification of intent after the publication of Advanced Notice, submit it within 90 days after such publication. The notification of intent should be submitted in the form of a EUA report with a cover letter, and a notation on the cover letter says, "Attention, notification of intent." The information requested in your notification of intent include, of course, general information, the contact information of you and your company, your EUA request number, and a list of all model numbers and any other device identifying information under the EUA authorization, and whether you plan on continue distributing your device, in which case you need to submit a marketing submission, such as a 510K submission. You need to. So in your notification of intent, you're also recommended to include a plan, which I nickname it as a risk mitigation plan. By the way, the yellow letters are my suggestions, my explanations, my thoughts, and my suggestions. They are not the FDA's language in the guidance documents. So you are required to include an explanation of your plan to tell the FDA how do you plan on discontinue distributing your device once the EUA is terminated, or how do you plan on addressing the potential risks of those already distributed devices before the termination of the EUA. The FDA recommends you, with respect to the already distributed products, the FDA recommends you to restore the device to a previously FDA cleared or approved version. What does that mean? That means if you had some upgrading of your device under the EUA, for example, you had an upgraded software, or you had a more state-of-the-art component adding to your device when you applied for the EUA. Now, as your EUA is terminating, you need to restore the software back to its original version. You need to replace that new components with the older version components. So your device is fully back to the terms of its previous FDA clearance or approval. And also you need to provide updated labeling, both physical copies and electronic copies of updated labeling to reflect the current regulatory status of your product. As you will see during our presentation today, we'll talk about restoration and the labeling update again and again and again, because those are the most important things that you need to keep in mind. You need to update your labeling to reflect that now you do not have EUA authorization and you either submitted market submission and waiting for the final decision, or you do not intend to continue marketing your product. These all need to be reflected in your labeling. And any other efforts to address or mitigate potential risks of devices that remain distributed after EUA termination date, since the FDA does not intend to request you to remove those products off the market after the EUA termination date. So we talked about notification of intent. The next subsection, section V, subsection B, is marketing submissions for devices distributed after the EUA termination date. If regardless of what type of device you have, if you intend to continue marketing your device after the EUA termination date, you need to submit your marketing submission, which is either a 510(k) clearance, a PMA application, or any other type of marketing submission, such as an HDE or de novo classification request, etc., etc. It is very important for you to know that you must submit your marketing submission before the EUA is terminated, and you also must have your marketing submission accepted by the FDA before the EUA is terminated for you to be able to continue marketing your products after the EUA termination date before you even receive a final decision from the FDA. So it is important to understand that the FDA only requires your marketing submission to be submitted and accepted by the FDA. It's not necessary for your marketing submission to be approved or cleared before the EUA termination date for you to continue distributing your product. After the EUA termination date, you are now out of the EUA terms and you are held to be fully compliant with all the FDA normal regulatory requirements, including the requirements of applicable to your respective marketing submission, including the applicable 510(k) requirements or PMA requirements, even though you have not yet received the FDA's final decision, as well as quality system regulations. During COVID-19, you might be exempted from complying with for example, the good manufacturing practice requirements and other quality system regulations. And now, right after the EUA is terminated, you are subject to those requirements. And you are also subject to adverse event reporting requirements in case that during the COVID-19 period, you were exempted from those requirements as well. As well as the normal FDA registration, listing, the unique device identification, the whole registration process. If you are not required to comply with the whole package, you are now, once your EUA is terminated, you have to get on the FDA's website, you have to register your establishment, you have to do the whole 9 yards of registration and product listing. Section V, subsection 1, the FDA recommend to include in your marketing submission a transition implementation plan. This is very similar to what we talked about, the risk mitigation plan, except that this plan you have to include this plan in your marketing submission. The purpose is, again, to address the potential risks of the already distributed devices. Once the EUA is terminated and you have not received a final FDA decision on marketing submission yet. So during that vacuum period, your product are without any sort of FDA authorization or approval. How do you deal with the potential risks? The information included, you should include in the transition implementation plan. Again, you need to give the FDA an estimated number of devices, how many devices you have already distributed in the market, and an explanation of a benefit risk-based plan for disposition of your products if you receive a negative decision from the FDA on your marketing submission, as well as an explanation of your plan if you receive a positive decision on your marketing submission. In the next slide, I'll give you more details about these two plans that you need to include in your marketing submission. The benefit risk-based plan is more or less the same thing as the risk mitigation plan. How do you plan on disposing the already distributed product in the event you receive a negative decision? Note that the FDA does not intend to request you to remove those products off the market. You can leave them, but if you plan on leaving your products in the market, you need to tell the FDA your rationale for doing so. Why do you believe your products should be and can be left on the market? And you also need to address certain considerations, the following considerations. For example, the process of notifying your end users and distributors that your products are now out of any sort of FDA authorization or clearance or approval. And the process and timeline for restoring your already distributed devices to a previously cleared or approved version, as well as updating your labeling and make your labeling publicly available. And also a description of maintenance plan for already distributed devices. And you also need to include an explanation of your plan in case you receive a positive decision on your marketing submission from the FDA, which would include a process of notifying your distributors and end users. And I'm sure you will be very happy to send out that notification letter, starting with, we are very pleased to advise you that our product is now received the FDA's clearance or approval. And also a process and timeline to provide updated labeling or component reflecting the changes made to the cleared or approved devices if you have not already starting on that process yet. Section VB subsection 2 is entitled Enforcement Policy for Devices with a Marketing Submission under Review by FDA. What does the FDA intend to do after your EUA is terminated and your marketing submission is submitted and accepted by the FDA, but you don't have any decision from the FDA yet? What does the FDA intend to do? The FDA does not intend to object to the continued distribution of devices within the scope of this guidance, which means the FDA does not intend to request you to remove those products off the market. As long as both conditions satisfy, which is you submitted a marketing submission to the FDA and your marketing submission is accepted by the FDA before the EUA termination date, and you have not received a final decision from the FDA yet, you can continue distributing your products even though the EUA has already been terminated. So marketing early submission of your marketing submission is really the key here. And also, the FDA will enforce labeling update to accurately state the device's regulatory status. And the FDA suggested some language in your updated labeling, which says the product was authorized under an EUA issued during the COVID-19 PHE and remains under FDA review for either a 510(k) clearance or an FDA pre-marketing approval. Section V, subsection C. What do you need to do if you do not intend to continue to distribute your device after the EUA termination date? We've talked about what you need to do if you intend to continue distributing your device. You need to file notification of intent, you need to file marketing submission. But if you do not intend to continue marketing your products after EUA, the FDA does not intend to object to the disposition of already distributed devices. Again, the FDA does not intend to request you to remove your devices from the market. If you have a single-use, non-life supporting, non-life sustaining device, such as face masks or hand sanitizers, you don't have to do anything other than probably file a report of corrections or removals, which we'll talk about in a few slides later, which is a very simple report to file on the FDA through the FDA's website. Other than that, you don't need to do anything. The FDA is not going to disturb your continuing marketing. It's not going to disturb the products that you've already put in the market. If you have a reusable, non-life supporting, non-life sustaining devices, maybe covering most of the class 2 devices, for example, remote patient monitoring devices, those wearable monitors, those devices can remain to be distributed and consumed by their end users, provided, again, you restore them to their previous cleared or approved version, and you provide updated labeling to tell the end users that the EUA are now terminated and you do not intend to continue marketing your devices. If you have a reusable life-supporting, life-sustaining devices, some class 2 devices and most of the class 3 devices, again, they can remain distributed, provided that you restore them to their previous cleared or approved version and you make updated labeling publicly available. It really is much more flexibility that the FDA is giving to manufacturers than we expected before the guidance documents. If you have in vitro diagnostic devices and you do not plan on continue marketing those diagnostic devices, the end users can continue using them until 2 years after the EUA termination date or until the expiration date of those diagnostic devices, whichever comes sooner. Section V, subsection D, discontinuing distribution of a device. When does the FDA expect you to finally discontinue the distribution of your device? The FDA expects you to discontinue your marketing your device on the date that the EUA is terminated, unless, of course, you have submitted your marketing submission and your marketing submission is accepted by the FDA before the EUA termination date. If you failed to do If you fail to take these steps, you must discontinue marketing your products on the same date as the FDA publishes the termination of the EUA declaration. The FDA also expects you to discontinue distributing of your products on the date that you receive a negative decision from the FDA on your marketing submission. If the FDA rejects or denies your 510(k) application or your pre-marketing approval application, you must immediately discontinue your product. And also, if the FDA sends you a letter requesting additional information and you fail to provide that additional information within the time period specified in the FDA letter, you must immediately stop distributing your products. It is important to note that certain FD&C Act requirements may extend beyond cessation of distribution because you've already had your products in the market way before the FDA terminates your EUA, and the FDA is not requiring you to remove those products from the market. Therefore, even if you stop distributing new products, you are subject to adverse event reporting and certain other requirements for your already distributed products. Some additional considerations. Before the EUA termination, manufacturers are expected to have completed any steps necessary to transition into compliance with all of the FD&C Act requirements under normal operation once the EUA terminates. The FDA does not intend to object to the continued distribution of certain products, provided that, again, you submit your marketing submission and your marketing submission is accepted by the FDA before the EUA termination date, and you have not received FDA final decision yet. Another additional consideration. Under Section 704A1 of the FD&C Act, the FDA may start conducting site inspections in your warehouse, in your establishment, to inspect your product line, your documentation, your record keeping, and your documentation. So be prepared. The FDA would take that action. The last, but certainly not the least, this additional consideration applies to a very common phenomenon, very common events happened during the COVID-19 period, which is you have the non-traditional manufacturers redirecting their production to produce products that are related to COVID-19 diagnosis, treatment, or prevention. For example, one of our clients was a producer for perfumes, and during the EUA, during the COVID-19, they redirected their line to producing hand sanitizers. So these non-traditional manufacturers, they may not be, before the pandemic, they were not subject to the heightened, stringent requirements for medical devices. So the FDA expects that these non-traditional players may take more time to address the transitioning. And the FDA is willing to give them more time, and the FDA is willing to make compliance and enforcement decisions on a case-by-case basis with these non-traditional manufacturers. And the FDA will also allow these manufacturers to request an exemption or variance from the quality standard requirements, the QS requirements, provided that such a request must be made within 90 days from the publication of advance notice. So I put together a little summary to help you, such a sort of a checklist to help you understand what the FDA requires you to do. After the EUA is terminated, if you intend to continue marketing your product, you need to submit a notification of intent if your product falls under the product codes listed in Table 1. You need also to submit a marketing submission and have it accepted by FDA before the termination of EUA. In the marketing submission, you need to include a transition implementation plan to address what you plan to do to deal with the potential risks if you receive a negative decision from the FDA, and also what you need to do if you receive a positive decision from the FDA. You also need to have a risk mitigation plan, and you need to include that plan in your notification of intent if the FDA so requires. But either way, you need to keep that plan on file in case the FDA needs you to explain to them, to address to them, how do you plan on mitigating the risks of your already distributed devices. So the 2 points that we keep talking about, restoration and the labeling update, are very important risk mitigation strategies that the FDA recommends. You need to update labeling and make your updated labeling publicly accessible. And also you need to comply with all the EUA terms before EUA termination and comply with all the marketing, with the applicable marketing submission requirements after EUA termination. What do you need to do if you do not intend to continue marketing your device after EUA termination? You need to submit your notification of intent if you have the reusable life-sustaining, life-supporting product. You need to have a risk mitigation plan to address your already marketed products. You need to, for certain products, you need to file a report of corrections or removal to the FDA. And you need to continue comply with the EUA terms before the termination and restore your devices and update your labeling after the EUA termination. You also need to comply with adverse event requirements for certain products. So at the end of the guidance document, the FDA provides a few examples to help you understand the process. Example 1, if you have a single-use surgical mask marketed, there's a typo, I'm sorry, marketed under the EUA, and you do not intend to continue distributing beyond the EUA. The hypothetical advance notice publication date is July 1st, and the hypothetical termination date of your EUA is January 1st. So on January 1st, you stop distribution, and you need to file a report of corrections and removals to the FDA, which is a simple report you file on the FDA's website, and you must submit it within 10 working days of correction or removal after you, after you receive the EUA termination. And for your already distributed products, they can remain distributed and consumed, continue to be consumed by end user. You're not required to do anything. You're not even required to give the FDA a risk mitigation plan. The second example is a continuous ventilator. And I think what the FDA meant to say is a reusable ventilator. So again, the advance notice publishes on July 1st, and the EUA termination date will be on January 1st. And before August 1st, within 30 days of the advance notice publication, the manufacturer submitted a notification of intent, informing the FDA that it does not intend to pursue marketing submission. And on the termination date, January 1st, the manufacturer stops distribution. The FDA does not intend to object to the already distributed products. They can remain in market and remain to be used by the end users, provided that you provide a physical copy of updated labeling to the end users and the hospitals that, you have to tell them that your product is out of EUA and you have the expressed interest, and you do not intend to continue marketing your product. And in that situation, the FDA says, for healthcare facilities wishing to retain the ventilator for use in the future use would be subject to regulatory requirements of future authorization, including marketing authorization or EUA. It really is not that clear what the FDA means to say in this sentence. We expect some clarifications in the final guidance. Example 3, if you are a non-traditional device manufacturer and you worked with a traditional device manufacturer or an original equipment manufacturer, or in short terms, an OEM to produce ventilators designed by the OEM, authorized under the EUA. Advance notice is published on July 1st, and EUA will be terminated on January 1st. Before August 1st, the OEM submitted the EUA report and informing the FDA that it intends to file marketing submission. On October 1st, which is I think 90 days after the publication of the advance notice, the OEM submits marketing submission to the FDA, including a transition implementing plan for already distributed ventilators. On the EUA termination date, if the OEM and contract manufacturer, non-traditional manufacturer, must both comply with all applicable regulatory requirements, the marketing submission requirements. However, since we have a non-traditional device manufacturer here, that non-traditional player can talk to the FDA if it needs more time. The OEM's marketing submission has been accepted by the FDA before the termination of the EUA, and the OEM has provided updated labeling. Therefore, the FDA does not intend to object to the continued distribution of the ventilators after the EUA is terminated, but before the FDA issues a final decision on the marketing submission. So, turn out the FDA issued a negative decision, a withdrawal of the marketing submission or authorization because the OEM fails to respond to FDA's request for additional information. And then the FDA and OEM will engage in benefit risk plan discussion to address how to mitigate the risks of the already distributed devices. And the FDA may request that the firm initiate a recall of devices in certain circumstances. Based on what the document shows so far, the FDA normally will not object to the continued distribution of the devices, but the OEM must stop distributing new devices after it receives negative decisions from the FDA. So another example, example 4, which is a molecular diagnostic testing kit manufactured by a commercial manufacturer under an umbrella EUA. So July 1st, an advance notice is published, with a termination date of January 1st. On October 1st, the manufacturer submits a marketing submission to the FDA, including a transition implementation plan, as we talked about, for the already distributed products. And on the EUA termination date, January 1st, manufacturer must comply with all applicable regulatory requirements. If the manufacturer's marketing submission is accepted by the FDA prior to the EUA termination, and the manufacturer has provided updated device labeling, then the FDA does not intend to object to continue the distribution. The manufacturer can continue distributing its products after the EUA is terminated until it receives a FDA final decision. So in this scenario, the manufacturer receives a positive decision, and there are no outstanding issues identified during FDA review that would result in a correction or removal of already distributed products. Then the manufacturer can continue distributing its products after EUA termination. So that was the transition plan for EUA authorized products. Now let's look at the companion guidance, the transition plan of devices under enforcement policies. This companion guidance applies to devices subject to 17 enforcement policies during the PHE. And it also gives the manufacturers 180 days, beginning on an implementation date of the guidance, which is, in other words, beginning on the finalization date of the guidance. But you will see that it also varies. It imposes the same requirements, the same steps that you need to take as provided in the EUA transition plan. So the enforcement policy, the 17 affected enforcement policy are listed on the list 1 in the guidance document. So here is the important thing to understand. When is the implementation date of this guidance document? It depends. If the issuance of the final guidance comes before the expiration of the public health emergency, comes before HHS issues a declaration to say now the public health emergency is finally over, then the implementation date of the guidance document will be the same date as the PHE expiration date. And that's when phase 1 begins. And in 90 days, phase 2 will begin. And in another 90 days, phase 3 will begin. And we'll tell you what you need to do during those 3 phases. In the alternative, if the FDA finalizes the guidance document after the PHE, the public health emergency, expires, then the implementation date of the final guidance will not be the date that the FDA finalized the guidance documents, but it will be at least 45 days later, 45 days after the FDA finalizes the guidance documents. And that will be when phase 1 begins. So in a nutshell, what you need to do in those 3 phases, phase 1 begins on the implementation date, whatever that date is. The manufacturers should start following adverse event reporting requirements. They should start preparing for marketing submission to help avoid supply chain disruption if you need, if you intend on continuing distributing your product. And if your product, in the case that your product is subject to a marketing submission, you need to prepare begin preparing for the submission in phase 2. And you also need to submit reports for corrections and removals to tell the FDA how do you plan on removing your product or discontinue your product. Phase 2 begins 90 days after the implementation date. So during phase 2, if you plan on continue distributing your product, you should now begin to follow the registration and listing requirements. You should submit notification of intent for certain reusable, life-sustaining, life-supporting devices. And I have to admit, I don't know whether any reusable, life-sustaining, life-supporting devices were brought on the market under enforcement policy. Maybe some of them were, some of the usage of some of them may be expanded under enforcement policy. So if you have that type of product, you need to submit a notification of intent. And you also need to submit a marketing submission and have it accepted by the FDA, just like we talked about with respect to EUA. And you need to include a transition implementation plan. And you need to comply with the full scale of FDA registration. Phase 3 begins 180 days after the implementation date. So phase 3 is the end of the transition period. In phase 3, the FDA will withdraw all 17 enforcement policy guidances listed on that list, and manufacturers should comply with all applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. And distribution should be discontinued unless marketing submission made and accepted and no final decision received from the FDA. These are all the same requirements as with respect to the EUAs. So the FDA encouraged comments made on whether 180 days period is sufficient. It may made even longer in the final guidance, and whether the guidances are helpful. So hopefully some of the confusing points during this webinar, whether I identified them or whether I failed to identify them, but my presentation is still confusing to you, hopefully the FDA will provide clarifications in the final guidance. And with that, we conclude today's webinar.